Welcome to Impact Disciple Making Podcast, this very first edition of a brand new podcast all about disciple making. I'm Mike Keaton, your host, and I am with Ken Adams, Senior Pastor of Crossroads Church and founder of Impact Discipleship Ministries. And we're here today to talk about disciple making and just have conversations about that subject. And so Ken, with all the podcasts that exist out there, and there are so many, why do we need another podcast?
Well, you know, Mike, that is a great question as we kick off this very first episode of a brand new podcast that is just committed to the goal of making disciples that make disciples. You know, the simple answer is that there's just not anything like that, like this podcast, available today. In fact, if you go Google the phrase disciple making, you will be surprised at how much of a void there is for information about how to make disciples. There's lots of curriculum available and there's some books available, but there's really not very many podcasts that are designed specifically to help people make disciples that make more disciples. So we believe that there's a real need for this kind of instruction and for this kind of encouragement, man. So we're giving it a shot.
Great. Look forward to it. So with that design in mind, that idea in mind, what do you want to cover with this podcast?
Yeah, we want to make this podcast a podcast that is really kind of all things disciple making. And so we want to cover a wide range of topics. As we move forward with these podcasts, we want to really talk some about the vision of disciple making. We want to talk about how Christ went about making disciples. So we'll spend a lot of time looking at disciple making through the grid of Christ's life. We're going to talk some on very practical note, some real how-tos about how does it work in a small discipleship group setting? What do we look for in the lives of the people that we're discipling? How do we select the right people? And what does that process look like? I mean, we really will cover it from A to Z. We're going to take a look at really disciple making pretty much from every angle that we can look at.
All right, so every angle we can look at in all things disciple making, to me, doesn't sound like it's got a limited audience. Who do you really see this being for?
Yeah, you know, obviously you would think a podcast that is devoted to disciple making, you would think that is definitely something that pastors would want to be able to check out and want to be able to hear. You would also think that other church leaders and church staff people. But you know, when Jesus gave the Great Commission, you know what? He didn't limit it to church staff people. He didn't even limit it to people who had the gift of leadership. You know, when Jesus gave the Great Commission to go make disciples of all nations, He meant that to every disciple. And so this podcast is going to be hopefully a great learning tool for everybody that's just committed to this, to the Great Commission and to Jesus' command to go and make disciples of all people and all nations in every generation. And so I really hope that this is going to be a podcast that's going to encourage everybody that's out there making disciples, and that they can learn or at least take a little something away every time that they tune into one of our podcasts.
That sounds great. And our commitment with that is to keep these short and simple in format. So what do you see happening here? What do you want it to look like?
Yeah, that's an important question. And the truth is that we do want to make them pretty concise, and we want to just sort of tackle one topic at a time and really create a library of disciple-making resources so that you can always go back and find out just what you're looking for and just what you need at that time. So we do want to use a format much like what we're doing here today. We want to have a lot of question and answer format. And so we really just kind of have a conversation about what disciple making looks like and how we go about the process of making disciples that make more disciples. And so we will, from time to time, maybe take a different path and even bring somebody in that is in the process of making disciples, and we'll bring somebody in who's got maybe their own story or testimony about disciple making. So we'll hear it from a lot of different sources, a lot of different places.
That sounds great. So back out, if you will, for just a minute here about getting the big picture view. What do you see this accomplishing? What's your big heart for this?
Yeah, well, Mike, ultimately, this brings us back to the mission of Jesus Christ. And so if we are able to come alongside people, and if we're able to educate, or if we're able to equip and help people to do a better job at making disciples and make disciples, then here's what happens, is that fulfills the mission that Jesus Christ gave us. One of my life verses is from John chapter 17, verse 4, and this is in Christ's high priestly prayer. Right before he left this earth, he prays this prayer. He says, to his Father, he says, I have brought you glory on earth by finishing the work that you gave me to do. And so, Mike, there's really nothing better than knowing that by doing what Jesus called us to do, by completing the work of making disciples that made disciples, that by doing that, we have brought God great glory. And so if this podcast helps people make disciples that make disciples, and we have helped people complete the work that God has given us to do and brought Him great glory, then every episode that we do will be well worth the effort.
Absolutely, and that's reason enough right there just to glorify Him, that it is the mission that He's given us, the church, to do. And so thanks for tuning in to this first edition of Impact Disciple Making Podcast. The reason why is to fulfill the mission and give God glory. Tune in next time when we discuss what's the difference between discipleship and disciple making.